Good evening and welcome to the third talk in Report Out's LGBTQ History Month series. We've always been here, Queer Histories of Kenya and Ghana. Thank you all so much for taking the time to attend. My name's Phil Thomas. I'm the lead trustee for human rights research at Report Out. Like everyone else at Report Out, I'm also a volunteer and very proud to be so. A very warm welcome to the event this evening, a recording of which can be found later on our YouTube channel. For those who are attending one of our events for the first time, Report Out is a global human rights organisation for sexual and gender minorities. We're based in Gateshead in the United Kingdom, but we have a volunteer base that spans the globe. We're currently approximately 80 volunteers and trustees from over 35 nation states, with the majority of our volunteers being from the Global South. Report Out researches, monitors, and records human rights abuses against sexual and gender minorities. And we use this research and these insights to educate people, governments, and campaigners to campaign for the human rights of sexual and gender minorities in every nation state. We've run a series of previous events on our YouTube channel for you to watch. We've had discussion panelists from all over the world, including Mongolia, Ghana, Russia, and even the Cayman Islands. We also have undertaken wider events covering whole regions such as South Asia, and also historical talks such as this one this evening, The Men in the Pink Triangle, about the experiences of LGBTQ populations under Nazi Germany, and an introduction to queer histories across the globe. That was the first event as part of our 2024 LGBT History Month series. We'll be popping the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. We'll very much recommend you check that out. If you want to sign up for any future events that we will be holding, please also sign up to our email list, which has exclusive access to events before they go available to the general public. The link is on our website. We'll also be adding that into the chat. And lastly, before we get on to why we're here this evening, we will also be popping in the donation link into the chat of this talk. We're entirely volunteer-led. We're a small charity with a big agenda, and it probably is not an exaggeration to say that every donation that we receive really helps further the cause of all that we do to report, inform on, and defend the human rights of sexual and gender minorities all over the world. So if you like and enjoy what you hear and you're feeling generous, that would be massively appreciated. So thank you very much. So now, moving on to tonight's event, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined tonight by two Report Out's brilliant human rights researchers, Arnold Ochieng Odinga from Kenya and Papa Kojo Ampofo from Ghana. Alongside being two of our leading researchers, Arnold is an advocate at the High Court of Kenya and the CEO of Ochieng Odinga and Company, a law firm based in Nairobi, Kenya. Papa Kojo is the researcher and fundraising lead at the Intersex Movement of Ghana and a prominent activist in Ghanaian human rights. So we've titled tonight's event, We've Always Been Here, as a direct rebuttal to the assertion that is often heard that queer identities are somehow a recent or Western-imposed invention upon states in the Global South, and that to be LGBTQ is somehow un-Kenyan, un-Ghanaian, un-Christian, or un-African. As many of you will know, this assertion is often used as a justification to enact punitive legislation against queer communities, breaching core human rights that every citizen of a country should enjoy, such as the core right of expression and association. The reason we wanted to bring this to the fore tonight is that LGBTQ History Month is a time to counter such narratives. And what we want to share with you tonight a little bit is just an introduction to the incredibly rich and diverse queer history of Kenya and Ghana, which Papa Kojo and Arnold are going to explain far more proficiently than I ever could. When we started putting this event together and Papa Kojo and Arnold shared with me some of the specific histories, I was absolutely stunned. I knew very little of these, and just to bring those to life just demonstrates, I think, that sheer richness and diversity across the cultures of modern day Kenya and Ghana, and should be seen as a counter to that common narrative now. We'll also cover some more recent history, such as the colonial period and the impact that had upon rights and identities of sexual gender minorities. and then how that period in history still lingers in contemporary policy and the way societies think about the rights of sexual and gender minorities. The good news for all of you is that this is the point that I stop talking and I hand over to Arnold and Papakojo. We want this to be interactive, so please ask questions in the chat. We'll try and get to as many as we can during the talk. I'll ask a few as we go along. And we'll do our best at the end to cover any that we don't get to in the course of the talk. So with all that said, I'm going to hand over to firstly Arnold and then Papakojo. Arnold, what would be great is if you could start by just giving us a bit of an overview of some of the queer history of Kenya and maybe some of the examples that you found in your research that you found most interesting.
Thank you, Phil, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us this particular evening. From my end, it's a bit late. It's almost 10 o'clock. So before I begin, I want to say good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you are. Thank you for joining us once again. Yeah, just to talk briefly about the queer histories, especially for Kenya. It's so interesting because, first of all, this information is so fragmented and scattered all over. Yeah, so that we rarely get literature or anthropological studies where you get all this history unpacked in one setting. Yeah, so that when you begin to read about queer history, for example, in Kenya or even in Africa in general, you have to look through and comb through a lot of literature and material. And most of the time, most of it is so fragmented and it is just mentioned in passing on most occasions. Yeah, but what we've attempted to do is like delve a little deeper on it, so that at the end of this presentation and in a few days, we'll get to read our paper where we've highlighted and given an in-depth analysis of what we shall be discussing today. Now, to begin, in Kenya, we look at it basically especially from the pre-colonial times, which is rarely documented. And perhaps one of the reasons given by even most scholars is that Africans and Kenyans in general viewed sexual issues, sexual identities, gender identities as something so intimate, so that they rarely wrote about it or even spoke about it. Yeah? So it was viewed more something as a taboo, yeah, because it went to the cultural attitudes, yeah, and just how people handled issues on sexuality, yeah. So that in this instance, there is little material. What is before in writing within the available literature basically is the overall analysis and the overall observation based on different communities. Now in Kenya, just by way of background, we have over 42 tribes with a few like 5 which are the majority, and then some are minority and some are still cropping up. Now going back to the history, the pre-colonial times, we had issues of sexual and gender minorities and identities, so that sex was not viewed in the normal way, the way it came about owing to the colonialists. Now, the issues of sexual regulation and all this came about because of the regulation by the colonialists. But before that, there were conducts and practices by various communities. And a good example, I take the example, you'll get to see it from our paper, is the aspect of the Meru. This is one of the most dominant tribes, where they had this thing called Mugwe, which were known as they played a religious leadership role, which they referred to as Mugwe. And for this, it included men cross-dressing, wearing ornaments, putting on women's clothes and hairstyles. And most of the time, they portrayed themselves as feminists. And also they portrayed those feminist tendencies and characteristics. So that in some of the literature, it's even indicated that most of them were actually homosexual, and they even married men. And again, when it comes to the female gender, now again, we get examples of the Kalenjin community, the Nandi community, so that for these particular communities, it was so common, the aspect of women-to-women marriages. Now, the literature gets more interesting because the literature views it in terms of the marriages were merely for convenience on most occasions, especially where one woman could not bear children, so that the man had to marry another woman for child rearing purposes. But the literature does not go beyond that. It simply says they're just living together, man and probably two women, but the literature does not go beyond that. For example, when the man dies, yeah, we do not get an explanation as to how comes now the two women continued living together, yeah, beyond that, so that the literature does not highlight that. Then again, some literature, interestingly, bring in the aspect during the colonial times. We also had options of, for example, children, buying children, if you could not try children, or you could hire children, purchase children, and all this. Yeah, but despite these available options, now we still have the existence of such female to female marriages. Again, another example of the female to female marriages, which within the Kenyan histories seem to be so common. It also extends to other tribal affiliations like the Gusii. This is also one of the dominant tribes. Then you also have the Kamba. Then you have the Gikuyu, which is actually one of the bigger tribal affiliations in Kenya. Now, again, we also have communities such as the Iteso, whereby this is even more interesting because it was more of the men who conducted themselves as women. They did a lot of cross-dressing. Then they even had the instincts of women, whereby they even wore women's dressing, women ornaments, and even took up women's roles. So that in some instances, we had men who were being identified as women. So that for this case, they would be considered as wives for that particular purpose. They even, at some point, they even took up names of the female gender and even conducted themselves as female. So that all this was evident even before the colonial times. So that given going by this particular narration and the availability of this existing literature, we see that all these factors and issues of LGBTQ and queer histories already existed before even the colonialization. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for now.
That's brilliant, Arnold. Thank you. Just one quick question before we move on to Papakojo and Ghana. You talked before about the histories that are there. They're quite fragmented and we have limited amounts of information to go on. Just out of interest, where does the information come from? Is it contemporary accounts? Is it from the colonial period? Who actually is telling these stories?
In fact, it is mixed. In some cases, we get the contemporary accounts where now we are trying to trace the history so that you get it, especially from the modern writers, whenever they're trying to now get and access the historical development, especially when they look at, for example, how have queer rights been developed over the years, so that most of them try and trace it from all over the beginning of time, so that we look at it and we find it in different writings. In some cases, we even find it in case law and judgments from the courts, whereby they're trying to understand how come some of the rights for the LGBTQ community were curtailed or introduced. So that most of the history is contained in modern writings. And as I had mentioned earlier, in fact, during the old days, issues of sexual identity, gender identities were considered so intimate, so that nobody spoke about them much, or nobody even wrote about them so much. But we can get fragmented information about it, especially on anthropological studies as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think just even in that 6-7 minutes, I think you've just shown a whole panoply of diversity in terms of pre-colonial history relating to kind of sexual and gender minorities. So thank you so much. Papakojo, can I hand the floor to you, and maybe similar to Arnold, just introduce a little bit of the queer history of Ghana to us?
Thank you so much, Phil. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Phil, can you confirm if you can hear me?
Hear you loud and clear.
Amazing. Thank you. Once again, hi, everyone. It's good to be here. And it's also really good to share my work. So just a quick background. So I give a context of why I started this research. I am an intersex and gender non-conforming person. And I grew up for the longest time not knowing my clan, like having a solid community and not even knowing what exactly my position within society is. And so when I went to university and I came across all of these knowledge, I kept wondering how I could, use it to maybe even learn more about myself. And that is what got me into researching about LGBTQ history in Ghana. I just want to make a quick comment that, unlike what Arnold said, once I started my work, it wasn't so hard to get literature. Honestly, it wasn't so hard to get literature. The only problem that I came across was the fact that the literature, even though they existed, weren't so detailed as you would expect research covering like an entire demography or community. But that is just something that I noticed. And another thing too that I quickly noticed was how much of a lie that had been sold to us, that queerness has never existed within the Ghanaian society, because it did. And for a very, very long time, it is also a lie that I bought into until I got into my research and I learned that it did. And what I seek to do was to look at the existence of queerness within major ethnicities in Ghana. So I took some of the most, of course, we have about 36, if I'm not even, I have it right. We have about 36 ethnic communities in Ghana. So I decided to look at the major ones. And what I found, for instance, among the Fancy people, so the Fancies is a community of, they live by the sea, and they are usually found in the central and western parts of Ghana. And so within the Fancies, they valued or they measured spirituality based on the weight of a person's soul. And it was generally believed that, and I mean, everything I say is pre-colonial, if it is colonial or even after colonial, because of course some of the histories that I am going to talk about still exist and is still practiced. So back to the Fancies and their measurements of spirituality according to the weight of an individual soul. It was generally believed that men had heavier souls than women. And so the same was applied for women when they were born. They are born and they grow up and they presented masculine. They were believed to have heavy souls, and these women were, had a higher status within the fancy society, much like the status of men in patriarchy. On the other hand, men who were also believed to have lighter souls were effeminate and were also very much, to even a larger extent, allowed to perform feminine duties, right? So that was one of my findings when it came to the Fancies. I was honestly very surprised because it's not something that, and I want to say I schooled within the central region where the Fancies were, are primarily located. And it wasn't something that you learn about. I lived there for close to 7 years, and I didn't learn of anything like that until I came across that particular ethnographic study. It wasn't only just for the Fancies. It was only for the Nzimas. And another work that I do is that I travel around Ghana and I document LGBTQ elders. And so this specific tradition, I am aware, is still in existence, not as in the marriage still happens, but there are a couple of people who are still alive who were a part of this practice. So this practice was the Agongole Ajele. And in the Agongole Ajele, there were different versions depending on the community, but still within the same ethnicity, where it was basically very regular for friendly marriages, same-sex marriages. It differed by community, as I said. In some community, it was regarded as, in current framework, it would be regarded as pedophilia. In other communities, it was very friendly between two women. In other communities, it was between two men, but it existed. It was also a very shocking wake-up call, because I remember very well when I came across that research, I tweeted about it, and someone reached out to me that, oh yes, I know this is my culture, and actually I have like a friend whose great aunt was married to a woman and is still alive. So yeah, I have interviewed her, and hopefully we'll be posting her interview soon. But yeah, apart from that, another thing that you quickly learn about the Ghanaian culture is that even though we try, like the society, the community has tried as much as possible to make it as heteronormative as possible, it is still quite difficult to get rid of the gender diversity that existed within the culture. When I started doing this research, I started paying very close attention. And one of the things that you quickly realize is how, for instance, our language itself is very, very, very much filtered with gender diversity. Our pronouns are, we don't even have gendered pronouns within the languages that we speak. That's also a research that I'm heavily invested in and doing. So many of the gods we worship are gender non-binary. Even, for instance, our language. So take the Ashantis, for example. So there is a word in Ashanti called sasso, and it's loosely translated into English as partner. And it can be traced to a time within the Ashanti culture when kings could elevate their male slaves that they found attractive into the status of a partner. And when that happens, the king could marry the slave, and then so the slave gets to be called sasso, so the king's partner. And when the king dies, the slave is beheaded and buried with the king. Ashantis like to pretend that this culture never existed in their culture. They are one of the largest ethnicities in Ghana that likes to tell you, say no to queerness, say no, all these are foreign cultures, but it's still very much within their culture. I think the last one on my PowerPoint is the Nankani, and it's still very much in practice today. Within that system, it's usually regarded as a system of inheritance, but also basically when a woman with a lot of, for instance, properties and is childless is allowed to marry another woman with a lot of children. So like a union, an economic union. Some of them were known to be very sexual. Some of them are still known to be sexual, while other ones are strictly non-sexual, depending on the communities. But yes, Phil, I think that is about that for me. I am sorry if I exceeded my time.
I would Papa Kojo, if anyone here says you've exceeded your time, then I would violently disagree with them. That was fascinating. What I particularly love about what you shared there is something that I think might resonate with a lot of people on this call from different cultures and backgrounds, that queer history isn't taught in schools, I think, in most places on the planet. And so you said, and I wrote it down almost word for word, that you were sold a lie and you bought it. And it just sounds like the sheer joy you experienced at uncovering some of these histories, much less actually finding people that were a part of it. Before we move on to go back into the history, could you maybe just bring to life what this has meant to you as an activist and a researcher? Because it just comes across as you're talking how. Oh. Can you hear me, Papa?
Yes, hi Phil. I can hear you, but I don't think I heard the last part of
Oh,
what
sorry.
you.
Could you just maybe share your thoughts on what uncovering this queer history has meant to you as a member of the community and also as a researcher?
Actually, yes. Actually, yes. So I mean, I went into activism with very closed eyes. And when I say closed eyes, I mean, I was a very reactionary activist where most of the work I do were in response to crisis. But I think I've reached a place where I needed more than that to motivate myself to continue the work that I do. And I found an excellent source of motivation from learning about my history. Because I think one of the things that we don't see is before like you can properly like dehumanize a community and maybe even get rid of them, you have to remove their history. And that is what has tried the entire anti-LGBTQ movement have tried doing for the longest of years is to erase us. Knowing that I come from a place of struggle, of fighting, where I come from a place where I used to I used to thrive, or even if like there was some suffering, I still existed. It's very motivating for me and even paints a clear picture of frame of the kind of future that I see for myself and the work I do as an activist. So and people were also very much interested in that. I love to say, because I remember very well that I did well, the first time I did this history, I uploaded the first video on YouTube with 0 subscribers, and within 24 hours, I had about 800 subscribers. I was completely blown. I was completely blown. So it just speaks to just how much people thirst to know, it just speaks to that also.
Yeah. And I think telling your story as you're doing here, it just serves as the most powerful counter imaginable to anyone trying to erase your history. We know this exists. Arnold talked about that the sources are somewhat fragmented, but the fact that we know of these stories is a clear and historical truth in counter to anyone who says that no such identities ever existed. So thank you so much, Papa, for sharing parts of your story and also some of the queer story of Ghana. I'd like to move it on to both of you, and just you both mentioned in your kind of opening statements, as it were, just a bit around kind of the pre and post colonial eras within your nation states. But could and maybe Arnold, come back to you first and then bring in Papa Kojo again. Could you just maybe give a summary of what the impact of colonialism was to the what you described earlier and those lived experiences of sexual and gender minorities?
Thank you, Phil. In fact, just to pick it from where Papa Kojo left it, in fact, over the years, we've seen an attempt to distort history, especially the history of sexual identities and gender minorities, and also a deliberate attempt to rewrite history in terms of omitting and sharing a certain narrative. Yeah. So that based on this research, actually, we uncover a lot. And as you pointed it out, Phil, actually, we are never taught this even when we study, especially my legal background in terms of law, so that when we go to the discourse about law and morality, it is also distorted in that we don't delve a lot into the aspect of sexual identities and gender minorities, so that it is deliberately left out for obvious reasons. Yeah, but this particular research highlights and brings to the fore actually the underlying issue and the historical development. Now, on the question on the impact of colonialism, now it's so interesting because during that time, the Africans, especially Kenyans, did not bother much about sexuality, gender identities, and all that. But when the colonialists now came, they brought in that socio-cultural, moral judgment of Christianity and Islam to Kenya, both of which considered homosexuality, sexual practices, and identities as immoral and a taboo. In fact, one of the authors points out that for Africans, for Kenyans, for example, they were so hypersexual and experimental. So that in one of the authors interestingly says that, in fact, the colonialists were trying to protect Africans from themselves because they were so hypersexual and so experimental, so that at some point, even the colonialists tried to protect themselves. If you look at the history of Kenya, for example, when we had the white settlers, where we had segregated communities for the white settlers, the servants and the masters, so that at some point, even the masters were trying to protect themselves from the hypersexual nature of their own servants. So that for them, they thought it wise to control and regulate the African sexualities. And this becomes more interesting because it even manifests itself how these particular laws were made. For example, if you look at Kenya and the general British colonialists, yeah, and within the British territories, they introduced the 1862 Indian Penal Code, which was to govern all British territories. So that under this particular law, for example, this was the first codification. What they introduced are the sodomy laws, yeah, which specifically targeted men. Also, what they refer to as having carnal knowledge against unnatural carnal knowledge. Yeah? This was the first, what we popularly refer to them as sodomy laws. And they're so common even until now. If you compare most of the British colonies, you will see that most of the countries have still retained these sodomy laws, and they have borrowed heavily, and they both stemmed from the Indian Penal Code. So that this was the first form of codification, which proceeded on, and which was mainly aimed at regulating African sexualities. Now, the other interesting bit that most of the scholars point out also is that even the formulation of these laws was done by the colonialists themselves, so that they did not involve the natives, as they referred to them, so that they did not give that room for debates or cultural considerations in the formulation of these laws. So that the same thing also cuts across when they also distorted other cultural activities, so that you also have the aspect of religion, so that now they viewed African sexualities and identities as taboos, as immoral, and religious acts, and they put it in quote, yeah, so that using the laws now, they wanted to now introduce and streamline now other forms of African relationships, so that based on that example and the codification of the laws, it becomes apparent that in fact homosexuality was an African thing from the very beginning, and it was in fact the colonialists who wanted to colonize and change that narrative and change even the relations among the Africans. And then the main aim of the codification and regulation of African sexualities, as it has been documented, was basically just aimed to inculcate European morality into the resistant masses. Now, you know, they were called resistant masses because at some point they were accepting some of these vices, some of the things introduced by the colonialists, but while on the other end, they were resisting some of them because they were still holding on. I think even as pointed out by many scholars, by African nature, they were so hypersexual and experimental. So this was something so that they largely opposed. So that based on all that, it is also documented that basically the colonialists did all this basically with an attempt to raise the local understandings of sexual and gender diversities. Yeah.
Thank you. For those who have that particular interest in history, I think just to underline, I think what you said about those colonial laws that were brought in to regulate what we would now consider Kenyan and more generally African sexuality are still in force today, 160 years on. People who would refer to colonialism as being something that's very much in the rearview mirror. Well, not if you're a sexual and gender minority in Kenya today. Papa Kojo, bring you in. What have you got anything to add on what Arnold said around the colonial experience in Ghana and how that has attempted to regulate people's sexuality?
Yes, actually, and I am even going to consider it from very two angles. I think both are going to, in the end, tie into what Arnold said. One of the first angles that I want us to consider is that I think we like to talk about colonialism as, and as we should, because it happened and it was a huge thing. One thing that we just don't talk about is how it changed. It changed successfully even the everyday relationship between Africans and Ghanaians. So, and it's also successfully permeated every single fabric of our culture. And I am saying this, I am going to give two examples to support this claim. The first is going to be our chieftaincy system. So, in an effort to model our chieftaincy system, much like Arnold said, in an effort to model our chieftaincy system, like the UK system, a lot of things were taken out, a lot of things were, tabularized, made taboos, and a lot of so you had religion agreeing with our traditions. And when that happens, whatever religion regards as a taboo, as a sin, becomes the tradition taboos. And unfortunately for us, unfortunately for the queer community, then the 1862 Act against the I think the human body also had been introduced, much like Arnold said. And so it completely added gender diverse people, and it led to a complete phase out and a complete demonization of gender diversity in general. And I think for me, that is my theory of how religion permeated and collaborated with tradition to, wash out a lot of these gender diverse culture. I think the second point I was going to make, I have tied it into the first, which also in the end supports everything that Arnold just said. That when you actually think about how the African society, sociologically were arranged and how the relationship that existed between them, it is completely preposterous to think that there existed no single, gender diverse communities within this community. As for whether those communities were accepted, as for whether they weren't accepted, it always becomes a question when it comes up when I talk about colonialism. And the question that, the concern that come up with, well, they could have existed, but they wouldn't have been accepted. And I would also argue that, well, that was the same for Europe. I mean, most parts of Europe anyway, until, let's just say, recently. So it's not something that we can argue that if we existed and if we were allowed, like African societies were allowed time to develop on its own and integrate on its own if it would have integrated with its gender diverse community, or it wouldn't. That is something that we would never know, but also it's something that we can never be sure of. At the end of the day, there is this evidence that queer people existed, and when you think about it, it is mostly just colonialism, pushing religion and trying to integrate religion within the Ghanaian culture and tradition that's led to gender, the erasure of the culture and gender diversity.
Thank you again, Papa Kojo. For anyone who's listening who is particularly interested in this question of the impact of colonialism on contemporary policy, report out, and Arnold was a part of this last year, wrote and submitted a report to the United Nations Office for a High Commissioner of Human Rights, specifically on this question. So we'll pop the link to that into the chat, but obviously I'm going to say this, but it's a really good read and actually just brings to life a lot of what Arnold and Papa Kojo have spoken about in terms of what happened a century and a half ago still has a insidious legacy in both states even now. So what I'd like to do now is just bring us up to date, bring us up to the present day. At the moment, both of you are involved in activism and in different capacities within your own nation states. Could you both just give a quick summary for the audience here of what is life like currently for sexual and gender minorities, and what are the narratives that you guys are fighting against in your own countries? And maybe we'll mix up a bit. Papa Kojo, I'll start with you and then hand back over to Arnold.
Thank you, Phil. I think one thing that we can agree on when it comes to currently in sub-Saharan Africa is that LGBTQ activists are going through it. We are having unprecedented amounts of number of hate bills spring up in very different countries. Homophobia is being pushed across so many misinformation, disinformation. It's not so different in Ghana. In 2021, an anti-LGBTQ bill that seeks to criminalize both activists as well as anyone who discusses the queer community, as well as forced conversion therapy on intersex children, even conversion therapy on queer people. A bill like that was introduced, and there had been a lot of back and forth about it in Ghana's parliament. Activists have written memos. We have the demonstrations. So many things have been done. It's in its final stage before Parliament. And today I was watching while they deliberated the clauses and which ones they were going to accept and which ones they weren't. As it stands now, the same-sex relationships is being criminalized with 6 to 8 years prison, with a 6 to 8 year prison sentence, as well as a lot of other criminal charges, including conversion therapy and specialized prisons, which have been sponsored and built by churches to specifically be used to incarcerate members of the LGBT community. Activists are expecting the bill to get passed any moment from now. And so that is what we are on. The fortunate news is that from the president of Ghana, we have seen, because the bill is being introduced by a private member. So far, all private members' bills have the presidents have refused to sign them into law, And right now, that is where our current hope is that this would also be rejected. But as it stands now, queer people's lives are very scapegoated, and you can never be sure. You can never be sure, especially if it's going to win some additional votes. But yeah, that is the general picture in Ghana.
I think it's worth just repeating and amplifying what you said, that if this bill were to pass, a consensual same-sex relationship could be punished by 6 to 8 years in prison, and not just a state prison, a prison funded and set up by homophobic religious bodies with a specific aim of perpetuating conversion therapy on those individuals. I mean, that would breach all kinds of core human rights of those communities. But I think it's I appreciate that summary, Papa Kojo, of what your communities are currently going through. And well, I think saying fingers crossed is being trivial, but we very much hope the outcome of even if it is passed, that there's a presidential veto does occur. But thank you for sharing that. Arnold, the picture in Kenya, I think, is somewhat different. But maybe could you just give a summary of, again, some of the legislation that has passed Parliament and it always before Parliament, and what the impact of that is on sexual and gender minorities?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I feel, especially this part, I feel, especially this is now the post-colonial era. And it's so interesting because I take it back a little bit from 1948, when we adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But then you look at all these years later on, we are still grappling with human rights, especially for the marginalized and minority groups. Yeah? So that it becomes more complex and more problematic. And it's more interesting because now at this stage, this is when now we have a lot of writings, a lot of academia, a lot of publications, and there is more awareness. Now people want to know and want to understand these issues. Now, within the Kenyan context, I feel also, and this is my favorite part, especially as a human rights advocate and a litigating practitioner, because we see a lot of involvement of the courts through the judicial intervention. So that, for example, in Kenya, the courts have, what actually brought this debate to the fore was actually the question of registration, the right to freedom of association for the sexual and gender identities. Now, when the Supreme Court affirmed that right and recognized sexual orientation as one of the rights that needs to be protected, and a person cannot be discriminated on the basis of their sexual orientation. Now, it brought a lot of uproar, especially from different camps, from religious grouping, for some section of the politicians and all that. And in fact, the Family Protection Bill of 2023 was more a reaction to the judgment by the Supreme Court of Kenya, which actually recognized sexual and gender minorities on the right to sexual orientation. Now, other than that decision, actually, in Kenya, we've seen a lot of judicial interventions, which has also prompted legislative progress. For example, through the Kenyan courts, the courts have been able to recognize the intersex persons. And in fact, in one of the decisions, the court, in fact, directed the Attorney General to formulate laws on the recognition of intersex children and intersex persons. So this saw the formulation of the amendment of the Children's Act to recognize intersex persons, so that for the first time in Kenya, the intersex persons were considered as a particular group in terms of sexual identity. Now, other than that, we've also seen the intervention of the court in terms of protection of the various fundamental rights and freedoms of the sexual identities and gender minorities. For example, the freedom of association. Yes, freedom of association, freedom for such organizations seeking to advance the rights and champion for the rights being registered. We've seen the courts intervening and allowing and granting orders against the government, compelling them to register such associations. Now, against this background, again, now we are faced with this Family Protection Bill of 2023, which is currently pending before Parliament, which seeks to introduce again some of the draconian measures. Again, it takes us back to the colonial times in terms of regulating sexual relations, so that now it seeks to even introduce more penal consequences and more penal sanctions for persons within the LGBTQ communities. It seeks also to hamper in terms of even research, which is even more surprising for most of us human rights researchers and advocates, because it's so problematic in that it seeks to even sanction speaking or generally having a discourse on LGBTQ issues, so that we're even wondering amongst ourselves as advocates and lawyers, if we're in court litigating over these issues, aren't we committing an offense in terms of just addressing or talking about all these issues? Yeah, so those are some of the chilling effects that we have in regard to the current pending bill. Again, now, even in Kenya, we're still grappling, and the courts are grappling with the question of decriminalization, because now there is also pending litigation which seeks to challenge the sodomy laws that were there, that were introduced in 1862, that are still within our statute books. But on the other hand, now we have a bill pending in Parliament, which seeks to now even introduce more penal consequences, so that it presents again that dilemma and that confusion. Yeah. So I feel we are still progressing well. And then now, given our role as human rights practitioners and litigation advocates, now the most, again, one interesting bit that I forgot to mention is the role of the regional courts, because currently we are also litigating at the East African Court of Justice over the LGBTQ issues. Now, as I had mentioned, for most of the British colonies, we borrowed from the Indian Penal Code, especially on the sodomy laws. So that, for example, what is happening within the East African community is basically spilling over to the rest of the countries. So that, for example, in Uganda, they had the Anti-Homosexuality Act for last year, which is now being challenged at the East African Court of Justice, and I'm part of that litigation team. So that, again, we are seeing possibilities of, again, a similar route. And one thing you'll note also is that the Family Protection Bill of Kenya has borrowed heavily from the recently enacted Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act. Yeah, so there is a lot of cross-borrowing, but again, the courts are playing a very fundamental role in terms of seeking to enforce the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is unfortunate that we are still grappling to ensure universality of those rights, despite having that universal instrument. Yeah.
And you've just hit the nail on the head, Arnold. I guess thank you firstly for sharing such a comprehensive view. Exactly as you said, Universal Declaration, human rights are not to be picked and chosen in terms of who gets them. And the work that you do, both for Report Out and also in your day job as an advocate, has been very much to remind institutions that shouldn't need reminding of exactly that. So thank you. Quick question for you both from Ben. What are some of the resources, groups, newsletters you'd recommend to further grow individuals' knowledge of pre-colonial and current queer African history? I posted the report out, obviously, but what would you guys recommend? Arnold first, then Papa.
Yeah, firstly, in fact, as the starting point would be most of our research we've done as Report Out, because if you look at most of our research, also we have a reference section based on the materials we've sourced and gotten this information on. Most of the materials are either reported, some are unreported. So you also have to dig in, especially also look at case law, but most of it you'll find in most of the materials that we've cited in all our research. Also, you look at our submissions to the UN, which a lot of them are cross-cutting, and also you'll also find most of the judicial decisions, especially in the report we submitted this year again to the UN on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and the court's intervention, and then also the existing legislation. So most of it is available within our Report Out materials.
Brilliant, good, wonderful plug there, Arnold. Thank you. Yes, we have recently submitted a second report to the United Nations exactly on the question of restrictions on LGBTQ core freedoms of association, expression and assembly, which will be going onto the website this weekend. And we're also going to be putting this talk onto the website too. Papa, is there anything you would add in terms of resources people can use to find out more about Ghana?
I think most of the resources have been shared with Arnold, but if it's specifically for Ghana, I am aware this work will be getting uploaded, so references will definitely come with it. I also have a video on the history of the LGBT community in Ghana on YouTube. So if you want a very simple video, the YouTube channel is documenting queerness. You should be able to find that, as well as a couple of other interviews documenting queer elders as well.
Yeah. And Papa's being also incredibly modest. If anyone's interested in the contemporary situation for Ghanaian LGBTQ activists, Papa wrote an absolutely fantastic blog last year, which we published on the Report Out website, called Beyond Our Trauma. I've just added that to the chat now. Please take a read of it. It's one of the most powerful pieces of writing I've been privileged to come across in my time with Report Out, and it's well worth 5 minutes of anyone's time to actually demonstrate the joy that hopefully you've also heard from Papa and Arnold tonight, that despite the unquestionable challenges that are being faced, uncovering some of these histories is an important part of that identity. Thank you firstly. So we're gonna finish up now, and I'm loving the love that you're showing in the chat to Arnold and Papa Kojo. You're saying it better than I ever could, but thank you both very much for sharing your time, sharing your expertise. We're very privileged to have you both as researchers at Report Out, and I think what you shared tonight, it is both incredibly powerful, incredibly interesting, and hopefully everyone who's been here would agree that it stands in stark contrast to that discourse that somehow being LGBTQ is a modern invention thrust upon African nation states by the West. What you've hopefully heard tonight is that both Kenya and Ghana and the societies that preceded the modern nation states have very much their own unique histories that should be celebrated, we should be proud of. And as part of LGBTQ History Month, hopefully we've just been able to tell a little bit of that story this evening. So just to finish up a couple of things, thank you all firstly to all of you who have taken the time to join us tonight. We hope you found it interesting, inspiring and useful. We in the chat, we've sent through a few links on our newsletter on some reading material, if those of you who are interested. As I say, we'll be publishing this report in a bit more detail in the days to come. If anyone is inspired by what you've heard tonight by Papa Kojo and Arnold, Report Out is still recruiting for volunteer human rights researchers, as well as events officers. The closing date is next week. Just pop the link in the chat. If anyone is looking for a way to channel their passion for LGBTQ human rights, shameless plug, we would love to hear from you. And there will be a feedback survey coming out very shortly that will come to your emails. We'd love you to complete that if you could take 2 minutes to give us some feedback. All of this helps us to shape further and future events that are interesting, useful and relevant. So with all of that said, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful, as Arnold would say at the start, morning, afternoon, evening, and hopefully we'll see you on another Report Out event soon. So thank you all very much and good night.